Welcome to our today's lecture in the ARVA series, dedicated to the North Pontic and Southeast Balkans. Together with Elke Kaiser, we would like to especially welcome our today's speaker, Dr. Adina Boroneanţ from Bucharest. Adina is a senior researcher at the Vasile Pârvan Institute of Archaeology of the Romanian Academy, and two of her main fields of interest are prehistoric archaeology and paleogenetics as a transition from foraging to farming. A third field, archaeometry, fits in well with her initial course of study as she graduated from the Polytechnic University of Computers and Automaton in 1993. Fortunately, if I may say so, she switched to first history and later to prehistory, receiving in 2002 her master's degree from the Faculty of History in Bucharest and her PhD in 2011 from the Romanian Academy. The topic of her dissertation was the Mesolithic Neolithic transition in the Iron Gates of the Danube, for which she was awarded the George Bariciu Award of the Romanian Academy. Adina has been actively committed internationally since the beginning of her career and has received several scholarships and grants since 2002, for example, at the Université de Liège, at the Freie Universität in Berlin, at the German Archaeological Institute, then as a visiting researcher with a Fulbright grant at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, the Hungarian Institute of Archaeology, the University of Edinburgh, and the Institute of Archaeology with Museum in Sofia. She completed her habilitation in 2017 and is now a PhD supervisor at the Vasile Pârvan Institute, which is part of the Romanian Academy's doctoral school. Also there at the Vasile Pârvan Institute, she coordinates the international project, the transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic in the Iron Gates area. This multidisciplinary study is being conducted in collaboration with the University of Edinburgh and co-directed by Professor Clive Bonsall. Together, they are currently excavating the Mesolithic Early Neolithic site at Schela Cladovei in the Iron Gates region of the Danube. Since 2002, Adina has been an essential team member in excavation projects under the auspices of the Vasile Pârvan Institute and has participated in many excavations dedicated not only to the Mesolithic and Neolithic, but also to the Paleolithic, to the Neolithic, to the Bronze Age and Roman Age. She covers with her expertise, in fact, all periods and ages. Apart from field work, she was and is team member in national and international research projects with a focus on interdisciplinary approaches, including both archaeometry, with XRF analysis, computed tomography, optical microscopy, spectrometry, and paleogenetics. For example, her studies on pottery and organic residues on pottery sherds from the Iron Gates are indicative of the tight connection between the archaeometric studies and archaeozoology and archaeobotany on the one hand, and paleogenetics on the other, when it comes to assessing past human diets and subsistence strategies. Given her wide range of interests, you can imagine that she has frequently been invited to national and international workshops and conferences, but between 2014 and 2023, she also had, on her turn, invited to at least 4 such events. And she was a keynote speaker at the 2022 EAA in Budapest. Also, her publication list is long and manifold. I will not mention separately her over 120 co-author contributions in peer-reviewed journals and collective volumes, but highlight only the monographies where she is involved with. She is author of 2 books related to the Mesolithic Neolithic transition, published in the Romanian language in 2012 and 2013, and co-editor of 5 others, all on interdisciplinary approaches in archaeology, among which I will recur only to the most recent ones, both from 2022. The one is co-edited with Monica Margarit, entitled Recreating Artifacts and Ancient Skills from Experiment to Interpretation, and the other is co-edited with Monica Margarit and Adrian Bălășescu in Romanian language on the exploitation of hard animal materials from the Cucuteni side of Drăgușeni Ostrov. Exploitation and subsistence are further keywords within her multidisciplinary research agenda, and I think that her studies on bone tools, the exploitation of animal resources, of animal environment, and natural resources will be major issues also in today's talk entitled Early Holocene Fishing Practices in the Iron Gates at the Danube. Please, Adina, the screen and the microphone are now yours.
Thank you, Agate. Thank you for this very, very kind introduction. I'm really very, very grateful for being invited here today. And I was thinking for a long time before I was proposing a subject. And this came as I was thinking of my excavations of the Danube and also just seeing recently how much the landscape of the Iron Gates region has changed following the building of the two hydroelectric power plants on the Danube, Iron Gates 1 and Iron Gates 2. And this presentation today is very much connected to that because of the building of these two power stations, the ecology of the area has changed forever. And much as we would like to recreate, at least, or reimagine how it was, it is almost impossible, and we have very little of it left. The Iron Gates is a remarkable area. It is located in the lower Danube at the border between Romania and Serbia, in the southeast of the Carpathian Basin and southwestern Romania. It is formed by two distinct physiographic zones, which is the upper gorges, which is a mountainous area, and the lower gorges, which is represented by the low Danube terraces. And in the upper gorges, the first part of the defile is flatter and the Danube is wider, and then you get into the straits of the Danube, which are called by the Romanians, in translation in English, the cauldrons, the bigger cauldrons and the little cauldrons, where the Danube is somewhere between 50 and 100 meters wide, and before the dams were built, the water was literally boiling, and hence the nickname of the cauldrons. The exploration of the Iron Gates was the outcome of a decision by the Yugoslav and the Romanian governments to construct two hydroelectric dams on the lower Danube, Iron Gates 1 and Iron Gates 2, that created a reservoir system over 230 kilometers long and flooding areas on both banks of the river. The rise of the Danube level, with as much as 34 meters at the first dam and 12 meters at the end of the reservoir, was affecting not only the human communities, but also the archaeological sites. Under the circumstances, the Romanian Academy created the Iron Gates Complex Research Group, and similar measures were taken in Serbia to study the affected area in all its cultural and environmental aspects. In many cases, though, sites were identified, archaeological sites, I mean, but no excavations followed, mostly because of the short time interval left prior to flooding. One of the main outcomes was the identification of an unparalleled record of Mesolithic and early Neolithic settlements, spanning the period from the beginning of the Berlin-Ellerod interstadial to the Middle Holocene. Over 55 caves, rock shelter, and open-air sites are known for the Mesolithic, early Neolithic period, which together have produced large numbers of burials and architectural remains and rich inventories of faunal material and portable artifacts, including personal ornaments and other works of art. Most sites are no longer accessible because they've been flooded by the Danube, but new excavations have been possible at Schela Cladovei in Romania and Vlasac in Serbia, and one new early Neolithic site, Aria Babi in Serbia, has been investigated. Developments in archaeological science since the 1980s have given new impetus to research in the Iron Gates. Scientific analysis of the already existing and the new collections, combined with new anthropological and zooarchaeological studies, has allowed for revisions of the ideas about chronology, burial practices, mobility, subsistence, technology, and ancestry. In many parts of Europe, archaeologists have sought to partition the Mesolithic into subphases based primarily on changes in lithic technology, especially developments in microlithic technology. But in Romania, and especially in what the Iron Gates is concerned, Any discussion of the chronology of early post-glacial settlement in the Iron Gates is complicated by inconsistent use of terminology in the past. It is noteworthy that the use of the term Mesolithic varies among Romanian and Serbian researchers. Most researchers refer to the archaeological finds of the late glacial as Epipaleolithic and those of the early Holocene as Mesolithic. However, in the case of the Iron Gates, this distinction is based on chronology rather than any fundamental change in material culture or behavior. There are about 50 Mesolithic and early Neolithic sites along the Danube gorges, and it is likely that more existed along the valleys of its tributaries that have been flooded following the creation of the reservoir lakes. And there are now more than 400 radiocarbon dates that created the chronology I have just shown, and they date from Mesolithic and Neolithic sites in the Iron Gates region, and they span the time from the late glacial to the mid-Holocene. It is worth mentioning that no site covers the entire time span, nor is there any apparent pattern in the occupation of the gorges, as in from the upstream to the downstream or vice versa. Most of these sites are on dejection cones or islands and caves. And the most important thing is that they're all multicultural sites. So other than Mesolithic and early Neolithic, other periods were represented. But in what Mesolithic and early Neolithic are concerned, all these sites are united by one thing, a high dependency on aquatic resources of the inhabitants of the sites. So when I came up with this subject for this presentation, I was aware that this presentation does not represent my work only. It is representative for the work of all the researchers that actually put their mind and contributed to the archaeology of the Iron Gates. So basically what I'm going to present today is a summary of a lot of work that was put on both by Romanian, Serbian, French, and British archaeologists together. So we first knew that the communities of the Iron Gates, Mesolithic and early Neolithic, ate fish because of the faunal remains. But it wasn't until the 1990s, when the fresh reservoir effect was discovered, that we realized how much fish they were eating. So they were eating that much fish, both in the Mesolithic and early Neolithic, that would allow for a fresh reservoir effect up to 540 years. So the next question is how you track fishing practices in the Mesolithic and early Neolithic that would allow to explain such a huge fresh reservoir effect and thus huge fish intake. So first we can look at fish consumption, and then we've got the faunal remains per se, then we have the stable isotopes studies, organic residue studies, and finally coprolites. And then when we're looking at catching the fish proper, we've got human remains that speak through the auditory exostosis, and then we've got the artifacts per se, whatever they are, and then we can connect to the fishing practices also through the fish symbolism, as in fish teeth and fish parts in funerary contexts, and later on during the transitional period and the early Neolithic, on the fish-related imagery and sculptured boulders and other artifacts that were found at sites, such as Lepensky Vir that we all know of. So when we talk about consumption, all sites yielded mollusk shell agglomerations and fish. And when I mean all sites, I mean both Mesolithic and early Neolithic. I will try and discuss them together, and then when there are differences, I'll specify them. What we found out is that there's a huge difference between the old and recent excavations. My own excavations at Schela Cladovei with Clive Bonsall indicated that we're just getting huge amounts of fish because we were doing flotation and wet sieving. Earlier excavation in the Iron Gates, with the exception of a very few sites on the Romanian bank, and the Serbian bank only did dry sieving. So most of the fish remains were hand collected, which resulted in poorer collections that we have today. Then at the very beginning, very few fish remains were recorded in publications. Just to give you an example, at the beginning, there was no sturgeon fish reported at Lepenski Vir, and that was in much contrast what we had on the Romanian side. So the picture is a very fluid one, and it changes with every publication that appears. But the main thing is that fish and shellfish remains were present at all sites, and at certain sites they were predominant in the assemblages, such as Cuina Turcului. Even back to the 1960s, the zooarchaeologist was noting that there is more fish than mammalian bones. And then 60% of the remains in Blazats, for example, are fish remains. Most of the time when we think of consumption, we look at butchery traces. This, unfortunately, it is less likely in the case of fish bones because of their bone porosity that obscures these traces, and also because some of the fish bones that we get are really, really small. What is interesting is the same species were fished during Mesolithic and Early Neolithic. So the same species were triggered, but they're differently represented in archaeological assemblages, of course, as I mentioned, function of their mode of collection and of, unfortunately, curation issues. And the main species that were fished were sturgeon, which is an anadromous fish, which means that it migrates every year, or it used to migrate before the dams, from the Black Sea up to the Iron Gates area to spawn. And there were 2 migrations every year. One that started, the earliest fish could arrive as early as January, but let's say March to June. And then there is another migration from September to, let's say, December. And then there's cyprinids, and then there is the pike family, catfish, and even trout, which would indicate that it wasn't only the Danube that was exploited, but also the small tributaries that are flowing into the Danube. And the fish sizes are variable, from the very, very small fish to the very large fish, with an example at Padina, calculated a 5-meter long, and carps that could weigh 300 kilograms. And I've added this table that shows you how large these fish could get. And actually, these sizes match what we found in the archaeological record. This all speaks about a seasonal fishing in terms of local communities knowing exactly when to fish, what species of fish, but also of selective fishing in certain periods of time. But this mixture of species allowed for fishing throughout year round. And although certain sites were said to be seasonal camps, such as Lepenski Vir and Blazats, we know that at Icoana on the Romanian bank, fishing actually occurred during the entire time, just based on the fish species that existed. So we've got more information about the aquatic intake from the stable isotopes. And then I'm not going to get into this because a lot of publications exist, but we know that this fish consumption was higher during the middle and final Mesolithic, and there was lower during the early Mesolithic, that is late glacial, perhaps because of the climate, and the early Neolithic, again, I'll show perhaps of the climate. So we've got plenty of sites with stable isotopes, which actually suggest that this is a general phenomenon, and it happens everywhere in the Iron Gates, which makes them kind of, during the early Neolithic, atypical communities. Then when we turn to organic residue, there are 2 types of organic residues that were undertaken in the Iron Gates, and there is pottery and there is lithics. And pottery, the first pottery study that we had was back to 2005, when Oliver Craig and his collaborators determined that dairy products have been kept in pottery vessels in Schela Cladovei. And then the same year, in 2019, we had two papers that gave, at first sight, apparently conflicting images. Kramp et al. Analyzed sherds from 5 sites, and on 46 of them obtained results for organic residue studies. And the study showed that aquatic products were regularly processed or kept in those pots, in contrast to other early Neolithic residues in the studies in the Balkans. But then Spataro and collaborators the same year was looking at 11 black painted sherds at Schela Cladovei, and determined that they were used mostly for holding ruminant fats and some dairy products, which is in agreement with the earlier finds of Craig and al., but no aquatic products. So the question is, how come that we've got these two different results? Well, one answer might be the fact that they came from different areas of the site. Area 6 was an area closer to the Danube bank, or on the Danube bank, that had early Neolithic overlapping a Mesolithic, a very dense Mesolithic occupation, whereas in the second case, it is further away, it is outside the Mesolithic occupation of the terrace, where it is kind of a pure early Neolithic site. So there might be a difference in chronology, but we don't have radiocarbon dates yet. Another answer is that in both cases for Schela, we have a very small sample of sherds, only 11. And then again, perhaps certain pots were used only for fish, because as we know, fish has a distinct smell and you don't want to drink milk from a pot that might have had fish in it. But again, we don't know anything for sure yet. When we move to organic residues on lithics and looking at fish, there's been a recent study of the Serbian colleagues that tried to parallel use wear and residue analysis on archaeological and experimental chipped stone tools on the site of Lepenski Vir. And they also took in consideration that traces of butchery had been preserved on some of the fish bones there. So they looked at 393 lithic pieces, and unfortunately, only on 2 artifacts, they were able to determine that they were used for fish processing. But interestingly, it is a scraper, which is a former tool, but also a flake, which is something that we would discard as debris and would not consider that it was something useful. But they encountered difficulties in distinguishing between meat and fish, both in what concerns the residue in most tools. And also they found out that specific fish wear in terms of luster was at times obliterated, probably by subsequent use of those tools for other purposes. And then finally, and this is something that me and my PhD students were working on, was computed tomography. We did computed tomography on pottery, but is not related to fishing. But we also did computed tomography on coprolites on 4 sites from the Romanian bank that belonged to the coprolites, both to Mesolithic and early Neolithic. We don't know yet whether these coprolites are human or canine, with the dog being the only animal that would eat fish in those days as leftovers from the humans. What we have seen is that all these coprolites are filled with fish bones, vertebrae and everything. The next step is to bring an archaeologist to look at these images from the computed tomography and try and determine what kind of species are in them, and also, if possible, well, I'm not sure if it is, but find a non-destructive way of determining if the coprolites were human or canine. But in a sense, it doesn't matter, because people fish, dogs don't. So if the dogs ate fish, it must have been fish that the humans provided. So now we're moving to catching the fish proper. And the first the first arguments that we get is from, again, human remains. Back to 1988, Freyer had determined that some of the skeletons in Vlasats exhibited what is called exostosis of the human external auditory canal, which is basically a bony growth which is created by an irritation in the external meatus of the ear. And it has been shown through the years that this appears many times because of the repeated contact with cold water and wind chill. And it's been documented archaeologically. It is a good marker of aquatic activity, and it's been documented only at sites that actually are located along cold waters. This does not appear in, for example, Mesolithic sites in tropical water. And this has been shown by a paper published by Villot and his collaborators back to 2014. Who looked at almost 450 individuals from 5 areas, Mesolithic and Early Neolithic in Europe. And Iron Gates was one of them. And 126 individuals that came into the study, of course, we're talking about individuals that had their part of the skull preserved. And interestingly enough, this exostosis occurred at almost 30% of the individuals, and they were present at all the 5 sites that were analyzed. And they occurred both in males and in females, with the exception, and in almost equal numbers, with the exception of the site of Vlasats, where only females were higher in number, but not statistically important. And it's interesting that this exostosis developed if you're doing this if you get in contact with cold water, as in bathing or diving, or get cold water in your ear for more than 3 to 5 years. So we're thinking of people that are definitely repeatedly in contact with water. And if you think that this is consistent with the stable isotope studies and the archaeological finds, the presence of the fish bones, it is more likely that these people were involved in fishing activities rather than, just bathing in the Danube. The number of these individuals decreases through time, and it's higher in the early middle Mesolithic and lower in the early Neolithic. Again, interesting is that the fish consumption is the same between individuals that exhibit this exostosis and individuals that don't have it, which might also mean that some people are more resistant and they don't develop these growths, but it might also mean that in these communities, whether you were a fisherman or not, you're still getting your share of fish. And then we found out more things from the fishing-related artifacts, which usually do not include only the fishing tools per se, but the tools for making and repairing the fishing gear, the tools for processing the fish, and possibly existing storage structures. And when looking at the material culture, I realized how little I knew about fishing, because I'm not a fisherman myself. But I grew up a lot along the Danube, and I remember when I was little and my father was excavating both at Schela Cladovei and on an island, then in the evening he used to go fishing with the local fishermen and employ all kind of tools. So I decided that, if I really wanted to understand how fishing works, I should learn something about fishing on the Danube and also look at ethnographical recordings, not as a mirror of what might be, but just to get an idea of the general attitude of people towards fishing and fish. So looking at pre and historical fishing, there's ways of doing it. We're talking about fishing in streams and rivers traditionally. So you can go by hand, everybody does it, even collecting shellfish and crawfish, on the sea, on the beach of the Danube, qualifies as fishing. Then noodling, which is only for catfish. It is very common in North America, where you've got men that want to catch the fish, just putting the fist in their mouths. And then fish collecting after floods, and their historical records for the Danube and in the Iron Gates, that after floods in shallow waters, there was so much fish that people had to go and collect it quickly within a day or two, so the fish wouldn't get bad. And then you go to the fishing with tools, the harpoons, bows, lines, and most often with traps, baskets, and nets. And this is what I remember from when I was growing up in the lower part, just before the second dam was built. And this is what people were using there, fences and weirs. And then also the traditional fishing, ethnographically, it is a seasonal activity, as the record in the Iron Gates seem to indicate. It's specialized, function of the species, different tools are employed. It doesn't happen in very deep waters, so along the shores. It's a collective activity, so it might involve a certain part of the community or the entire community when a lot of fish is caught and needs processing. And traditionally, it is done mostly by men, which is in, let's say, not contradiction, but it raises a question about women doing it at Vlasats. And then, of course, prehistoric fishing, you can do it from the riverbank, from a boat, which means you get in contact with water. Ice fishing, and we know from photographs and also historical recordings that the Danube would freeze over, as indicated in these two photographs, in historic times and even more recently in 2003. And another interesting way of fishing is by poisoning the fish. And when you think about prehistoric communities, line fishing is not really the way to do it, to feed a community that depends on fish heavily. It's an individual activity. You get small quantities of fish and it takes a long time. So even ethnographically, it was always said it was more recreational rather than means of feeding large communities. Then noodling, it is interesting because catfish is the only fish that guards its eggs. Once after spawning, the male goes and sits on the eggs on shallow, muddy waters. And at times, the back of the fish just shows outside the water. So it is very easy for fishermen to come. They usually try and fence it. And then this is the way it is done in America. One of them puts the hand in the mouth of the fish. And because of catfish physiology, it closes the mouth and it won't let go. So then you can pull it out and then it is clubbed to death by the whole team, because noodling is never done by one person. So even though the communities in the Iron Gates were not noodling for catfish, it was possibly to stun it, with clubs and, heavy boulders, and then just, kill it while sitting on the eggs. And then because the environment of the Iron Gates has changed beyond recognition, so the Danube basically in the two artificial lakes almost doesn't flow. They're almost like stagnant pools, and you get less and less sturgeon and less of what the fish species used to be. There are two sources that are invaluable for archaeology. Two men that lived pretty much in the same time, Mihajlo Tripković in Serbia and Grigore Antipa in Romania, who were both sort of naturalists, but Tripković was also a master fisherman, had his own fishery and was a passionate fisherman and ichthyologist, whereas Grigore Antipa was a scholar and a naturalist, but they both contributed greatly to understanding the fishing practices in the Iron Gates at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And Grigore Antipa also wrote a book on the ichthyological fauna of Romania, where he writes a lot about the species of fishes in the Danube and the Black Sea, and he describes all the sturgeon species and everything that we would find in the archaeological assemblage in the Iron Gates. So by consulting these books, and not only these, Grigore Antipa has 5 more books on fishing in Romania and in the Danube. So you get a very good idea of what fishing practices might have been in historical times. And I have illustrated here just a few of the tools that fishermen were using and the way they were taking advantage of the geography of the place and the geography of the Danube, and found the best fishing spots. The most interesting thing is that what the best or the historical fishing spots described by them are exactly the spots where the Mesolithic and the early Neolithic places were located. And this, again, is in the area of the weirs, of the whirlpools. This is the way it worked in historical times, and probably it worked in prehistoric times. So you have the Danube that is flowing, and then you've got this small kind of a protrusion of land. And then here, the Danube creates a whirlpool. Sturgeon is only used to go one way. So if it starts going upstream, it goes upstream. If it comes downstream, it comes downstream. So it comes with the current. It doesn't change direction and gets into the weirs or the nets that the fishermen had placed. And then you've got the net, and then with the uses of mechanisms which might not have existed in prehistory, the net pulls in and the fish is caught. And then sturgeon was also caught not by hooks that they would bite, but also you would put strings with hooks on them, and these hooks would catch the scutes of the sturgeon, and then they would just get caught where they are. Also, what the fishermen did to catch these huge sturgeons on the Danube, that they would put nets in between the riverbank and the many isles that existed, and nowadays they're flooded, and the fish were caught in there. And other people that were interested, so there's a lot of literature on fishing practices, and we've got traditional photographs with traditional nets used in the shallow waters with fenced areas, and mainly during periods of drought. And then this comes to, strangely enough, my favorite part, which is fish poisoning. Fish poisoning is done in Romania. It has been done in historical societies in North America, in Colombia, almost everywhere. Certain plants are toxic for fish, and they come from certain families, and the main chemical compounds are called saponin and rotenone. And these do not kill the fish, they stun them. So different parts of the plants are mashed and thrown in shallow waters. Sometimes they're mixed with fish food and thrown into the water. The fish comes, eats them, and the fishermen can come and collect them by hand or using tools. And several such plants are found in the Iron Gates. And then the same plants seem to have been used throughout the world for kind of stunning, paralyzing this fish. In many cases, if the fish escape and they go to clean water, they just come back to life. So it's not really a poisonous meat to eat for the humans. Now going back to the fishing tools, the archaeological evidence. What we find most on both the Mesolithic and early Neolithic sites are points. simple points which are used the same way as the harpoons, and they're hafted in a stick, or double, which might have been used as the gorges of North America, which are ethnographically attested as being attached to a string, and then with bite, and the fish comes and bits it, swallows it, and it reaches the stomach. And then we've got similar implements in various sites, and I've illustrated here the double points of Lepenski Vir. So we have points both in the Mesolithic and Early Neolithic, and they're found at all sites. Not the same goes for bone and antler harpoons. There's only one Mesolithic site that has yielded harpoons at Vlazac. And then there are several sites with harpoons during the Early Neolithic. You can probably see that they're typologically different. And then the Mesolithic ones tend to be made of bone, and the Early Neolithic ones of antler. Then we've got bone hooks in what is called the transitional period, and then also in the Early Neolithic. And strangely enough, they come from only from the area upstream, and they're collected to the Early Neolithic as indicated by finds in the south of the Danube, at Donja Branevina, for example, and Giulianica. They come on various sizes. They were probably used individually or online, as showed here, and with or without a bite. And then we've got plenty of fishing weights, but only during in the Early Neolithic. These fishing weights could have been at Schela Cladovei come in two sizes. You've got the smaller ones that were probably attached to nets, and we've got the bigger ones which weigh about 200 to 300 grams, and they were probably attached here at the base to this kind of equipment where the fish does not bite the hook, but it kind of grapples to it. And also there is ethnographical evidence that small fishing weights like this were actually greased, and then they were used as bait themselves. It's interesting also that at the end of the Neolithic, this stone weights were also came in the shape of pot weights. So sherds were chopped and given this this shape, but it's unclear whether those were used in looms or also at fishing. And then one of the most interesting things when I was doing the research on the fishing equipment is that very little comes in archaeological literature in what lures are concerned. They're difficult to identify in archaeological assemblages, and most of the time what I would suggest that were fishing lures were identified as adornments. But if you take a look at this Unio, perforated Unio pieces, they're quite ugly, and in none of them was there any, or I am not aware in the iron gates that use wear on either the inner side or the outer side that was associated with wearing them as a pendant. And these are very good for using as lures in the water because they're glittery and they would attract fish. And also this little tablets that come from Lepenski Vir and Quina Turcului have ethnographic parallels in elsewhere. And we don't, what we have in the Iron Gates, but well, in further up than the Iron Gates, are these late Neolithic fishing lures from Vincha, but are not similar. But this shows that in the late Neolithic, you have something that is recognizable as a lure. And then finally, we have the clubs and mattocks that were only found on the Serbian bank, with 38 of them found at Lepenski Vir, and some were decorated, possibly painted, and they showed use wear in the shape of a small depression at the end where that you would use to hit the large fish. And they originated inside houses and were associated with the ichthyomorphic sculptures. and at other times they're associated with lithics and faunal remains. And both Antipa and Petrovic wrote that Serbian and Romanian fishermen used clubs to kill the very large fish that they brought into the shallow waters. And again, the historical spots that the modern fishermen used in the 19th century and the Mesolithic and early Neolithic fishermen were using were the same. And then we have some evidence from for tools for making and mending fishing nets. We have this implement from Schela Cladovei, and it's got parallels at Doina Branievina, and then in historical times, and there's more than this, but I only illustrated one, needles for mending fishing nets from Latvia, for example. And then we've got this spool that was also used probably or possibly for weaving fishing nets. Fishing nets that would have been made of tree bark, of plant and animal or even human hair, as again, ethnography shows. Then we have the tools for fish processing. So other than the lithic tools, which are small in number as showed or as identified, this might also mean that processing was not taking place at the site, or it was taking place close to the riverbank, not inside the site proper. And some of the archaeologists suggested that the boar tusks were also used for cutting open and gutting fish, because the shape of the boar tusks resemble the knives that the fishermen use when doing these operations on fish. But then there are other ways of processing fish. There's fermentation, there's smoking and drying, which would leave no traces. Which brings us to the problem of the storage structures. There's no storage structures that have been documented per se in the Iron Gates. In Schela Cladovei, Vasile Boroneanţ talked about a few small pits, which were about 20 to 30 centimeters deep and about 35 centimeters wide, that contained massive amounts of fish bones. So these might have been small storage areas, but we only have one that was sketched on a plan, and it has a very irregular shape. So it makes you wonder whether that was really a storage facility. And then, of course, there are a lot of invisible tools that we know nothing about. All the fishing contraptions that I've showed you before, that Antipa and Tripkovic have documented, that were made of perishable materials, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this. But we have seen wonderful evidence from sites, recently, where this basketry has been preserved. And because of the two different areas of the Danube, the question came to me whether early Neolithic fishing that we know more about is different on the upstream from the downstream area. We have very little fishing equipment in the Mesolithic, so it's not worth trying to debate it. But we've got a lot more hooks. Actually, we only have hooks in the upper area, Quinaturcului and Blazac and Lepensky Vir. And we've got this so-called, what I would like to call lures, the perforated shells. And we've got very small weights that might have been attached to lines, or to those lines that have the consecutive hooks on them. But when you look at the downstream area, then you have more bone points, and you have the harpoons, and almost all of the fishing weights come from there, and we have this equipment for mending the nets. So we do see a difference in the of the fishing kit between the upstream and downstream area. And then we're finally approaching the end, and there is the fish symbolism that has been present throughout the Mesolithic to the early Neolithic. The earliest example we have is this small item that comes from the rock shelter of Cuina Turcului, which to me, it looks like a fish. I took the liberty of completing it, and I've put this Inuit lures down here, but you can see there's a fish tail, and we've got the belly of the fish, and you've got a delineation between the body of the fish and the rest of it. And later on, during the late Mesolithic, we've got this burials with double burials, most of the time with an adult and a baby, that were buried with teeth of this Rutilus frisi, the so-called the pearlfish, because it develops these tubercles on it in the mating season. And some archaeologists suggested that using this fish was actually mimicking the fish itself. And we've got these burials both on the Romanian and the Serbian bank of the Danube. And then in the transitional period, it's, you know, probably the peak of the fish symbolism with Lepenski Vir and the carved boulders. And I put here the just the example of Danubius, probably the most famous sculpture. And if you look at the mouth of these mouth shapes of these two species of sturgeon and the mouth of Danubius, and then you look at the back of this sturgeon and the scutes on its back, and then you look at the back of Danubius, you realize that these were kind of fish people. And then we've got the clubs that have the indentations on the side that remind the same scutes, and also a lot of kind of symbols that remind us of the waves. And the question is, what created at that particular time this tie between people and sturgeon? And one of the answers, but not the only answer, is perhaps the rapid climate change event at 6,200 to 6,000. It might not be apparent, but the change in the Danube water temperatures and the flow, and the changes, the sudden changes in the frost defrost, these all affected the fish extremely, and it affected the sturgeon a lot. So I think that the Lepenski Vir people, which was at the time probably the only occupied site, as radiocarbon dates indicate, or the only intensely occupied site at the time, probably worried about sturgeon and this kind of changes in the life they knew. And then Lepenski Vir faces this famous mountain, Treskovac, which apparently it is said to have given the trapeze shapes of the dwellings at Lepenski Vir. But also, Lepenski Vir, and if you look over the Treskovac, is one of the two places in Europe, other than Scotland, where you can see a double sunrise. And there is on YouTube a video that has been posted by Serbian astronomers. And then the sun rises exactly on the summer solstice, and it goes up, and then it goes down, and then it goes up again. So to the people of Lepenski Vir, this probably held a special significance. Just to summarize, and at the very ending of this talk, when you think of prehistoric fishing in the Iron Gates, then there are things that separate the Mesolithic and the early Neolithic, but not in kind of a great manner. During the Mesolithic, we had a main contribution to human diet from aquatic resources, whereas in the early Neolithic, it changes to significant. There is a poor reflection in archaeological assemblages of fish consumption and fishing, with no fishing gear almost, but plenty of fish bones in the Mesolithic, and some more equipment in the Neolithic. In both Mesolithic and early Neolithic, we have those exostosis that speak of contact with water. But during the early Neolithic, what was suggested was that perhaps certain species were targeted specifically at certain sites, because at Padina, the greatest percentage of fish was catfish. At Lepenskivir was sturgeon, and this was combined with the sturgeon heads, that carved heads. Then at Vlazats, they're the cyprinids, and at Ostrovobanului, it is the barbel. So it has been suggested that targeting specific species of fish make people in those communities identify to those species of fish. So you would have the sturgeon people at Lepenskivir and the carp people at Vlazats and the catfish people at Padina and so on, pretty much like you had the clans in Scotland. Still, towards the end of the Neolithic, we had two atypical sites, Aimana and Velesnica, which are downstream, where people did not eat fish. And these were interpreted as typical farming communities that had arrived in the area. And then again, Mesolithic and early Neolithic sites are superimposed, overlapped. You have Mesolithic sites, all Mesolithic sites have an early Neolithic occupation. But then we have a lot more sites that are only early Neolithic, and fishing still occurred apart from these two ones. Same fishes were present in archaeological assemblages, and perhaps different fishing techniques existed in the upstream and downstream area. But I would like to suggest that fish were more than food to these communities, and in a sense, perhaps those people really believed that they were what they ate. And thank you.